If the gentleman can't carry his assessment, the district would rather see that ground in hands that can. A schoolhouse full of men laughed at that, 3 rows deep, and a fellow by the window said something about letting the crawfish pay the taxes, and he took the rest of the room with him. That was the 8th of June. It started in April. On the morning of the 14th of April, 1916, water stood in Ephraim Ladson's cotton rows 9 days after the last rain had fallen. No rain had put it there, and Cypress Cut hadn't backed up. It came down a ditch 9 miles long, cut by a steam dredge that Ashlock County had borrowed $86,000 to put in the ground, and it emptied out 400 yards above his north line, at a rate nobody in that county had ever bothered to put a number to. Ephraim stood at the turn row in his father's boots and watched it work. It moved slow. That is the part people never got right later, when it got told and retold in town. It didn't come in a wall. It came about as fast as a man walks when he isn't in a hurry, and it took a row at a time, and it never once considered whose name was on the deed. Behind him, up on the high side of the place, a single mule stood in the shade of the shed, with her ears working. Anybody who drove the Cypress Cut road that week saw a drowned cotton crop and 80 acres of bad luck. Ephraim looked at it a long while. Then he crouched down at the edge of the water and set 2 fingers on top of a crawfish chimney, one of 1,000 little mud towers that came up through that ground every spring. And he thought about something an old woman had said at a funeral 5 years before, which he had not understood at the time and had never repeated to anybody. Now, if you've got a soft spot for people who stayed put after the whole county had already decided for them, the subscribe button is down there, and it cost you a second. It's the only reason I get to keep telling these. All right, April. The Ladson place had never been a big farm. 80 acres, flat as a tabletop 3 miles south of Elverton on the Cypress Cut Road, bordered east by a slough, full of pintail ducks every November and north by a section line that ran dead straight for 11 miles without so much as a rise to break it. Ephraim's father bought that ground in February of 1908. $940 over 6 years. The last note cleared in October of 1914. Bristow Ladson had come into Arkansas in 1881 in a chartered emigrant car out of Beaufort, South Carolina, one of 41 people who got off at a water stop with everything they owned tied in bedsheets. And he worked other men's cotton 27 years before anybody would sell him a foot of anything. When they finally did, they sold him the piece that wouldn't drain. Every county has one. On the Grand Prairie, they called it Crawfish Land, and they called it that because that is what lives there. 2 feet down under that black topsoil lies a pan of gray buckshot clay so tight a man can carve it with a knife and it will hold the shape. Rain goes in and stops. It sits on the pan and waits for the sun. Cotton hates it. Cotton wants air under its roots, and on that ground, in a wet spring, it yellows at the 3rd leaf and stands there all summer being a disappointment. So the county's name for the Ladson place was the Crawfish 80. Nobody said it to wound him. Out there, a name for a piece of ground is just a name, used at the gin and at the church door without anybody weighing it. And Bristow Ladson answered to it for 3 years, without one word of complaint where his son could hear him. What he said instead, scraping buckshot off a plow point with a shingle, was this: a crop is a year, ground is a name. He died in the fall of 1911, 68 years old, in a chair on his own porch with his shoes on. Ephraim Ladson was 45 years old that April, a wide-shouldered, unhurried man with gray coming in at his temples, and a white seam of scar across the back of his right hand where a mule had put him into a fence in 1902. He read slow and he read everything. He kept his hat in his hands indoors, and he kept his opinions where he kept his money, which is to say close and out of sight. His wife Rilla kept the book, every dollar in and every dollar out since 1908, in a hard-bound ledger with a broken corner, and she could tell you inside a nickel what a bale brought in any year you named. Their boy Rance was 17 that spring, tall as his daddy and quicker, with an opinion about the future that he had not said out loud yet. Their girl Dosia was 9, and she marked the water's edge every morning with a stick, because her father had asked her to and because she was 9. On the first Saturday in May, he walked the section line up to see the thing itself. The dredge sat at the head of the main ditch, with its boom swung out over the spoil bank, A black iron dipper big enough to hold a cotton wagon, taking a bite out of that prairie every 40 seconds all day long. Coal smoke stood straight up in the still air. The bank it through made a gray ridge across country that had not had a ridge on it since the last ice went off the continent. It was, he had to admit, a beautiful piece of work. He watched the outlet pour off the end of it, brown and steady, going where it had been told to go. By the 23rd of April, 34 acres were under. By the second week of May, it was 51, and Doshia's stakes had marched to the shed lot. And there was a morning when the sun came up behind the water, and the whole west end of that farm turned the color of a new penny for about 4 minutes. Here's the part that gets left out when this gets told in a hurry. Nobody flooded Ephraim Ladson out of spite. Ashlock Drainage District No. 4 was a perfectly legal thing, voted in by landowners in 1913, and its purpose was to take 5,200 acres of wet prairie and make it fit to farm. It sold bonds to buy the dredge, and the bonds got paid back by an assessment laid on every acre inside the district, figured on the benefit the engineers said each acre would receive, whether the acre agreed with them or not. $3.40 an acre every year for 10 years. On 80 acres, that came to $272 a year, due in one payment on the 10th of October. And if a man missed it, the district didn't have to hate him to take his land. It only had to wait. A delinquent assessment went to the courthouse door like any tax, and there was a land company in Little Rock with a clerk whose whole job was reading those lists. So the men who dug that ditch were not villains. They were farmers with bond payments coming due, and a dead flat county that wouldn't drain, and an engineer they had hired to fix it. They needed that water gone from where they were. It had to go somewhere. Water always does. Everything downhill of them was Ephraim Ladson. Otho Prine had farmed the 400 acres north of the section line since 1889. He was 58, a thin, sunburnt man who ran the gin at Elverton in the fall and never had a good word for anybody's cotton, including his own. He came down the line road on the last Friday in April and sat on the wagon seat a minute before he got down. The two of them stood at the fence, looking at water where there ought to have been a stand of cotton 4 inches high. "You're the low man," Prine said. "Low man drinks what the high man pours. That ain't personal, Ephraim, it's just downhill." Ephraim looked at the fence line a while before he said anything. The bottom wire had gone under, and the post it hung on had begun to lean the way a post leans when the ground under it turns to soup. "Then I reckon I'll be drinking a while." Prine chewed on that a while. When he said the next thing, his eyes had gone off up the line, to the place where the district's ditch came through his own back 40 in a stripe that hadn't been there 4 years ago. "They dug it in a straight line," he said. "Water don't know a thing about straight." Ephraim let that sit where it fell. He had a notion where it was headed, and it wasn't ripe yet. The notice came in the mail the second week of May. Public hearing on the equalization of assessments. Ashlock Drainage District No. 4 at the Elverton School, 8 o'clock on the evening of the 8th of June. Rilla read it out loud at supper and pinned it to the wall by the door, which is where that family kept anything with a date on it. Doshia asked what equalization meant. Her mother told her it meant a room full of men deciding what a thing was worth to somebody else. Rance asked his father whether he was going to go stand up in front of all those people. Ephraim said he was. There was a train out of Elverton at 6:40 every morning on the Rock Island, and that spring it was carrying young men north with 1 grip apiece and a paper sack of dinner. Rance Ladson had walked up there twice on a Sunday and stood across the road and watched, and had told nobody, which his father knew because Otho Prine's hired man had seen him and mentioned it at the gin. The boy said a thing then that he had been carrying since Easter, and he said it fast, the way you say something you have already lost the argument with yourself about. Ollie Frazier's brother had gone to Chicago in February and was making $4 a day in a packing house and had a room with electric light in it, and had written back that they hired men every Monday morning and never asked anybody where they were from. Ephraim finished his coffee before he answered. "Then go on to bed," he said. "It'll still be there in the morning, and so will I." That's all he said about it. He sat up 2 hours after the lamp went out. The school at Elverton held about 90 people. On the 8th of June, it held closer to 130 because word had got around that the assessment schedule was being opened. And there is no crowd like a crowd that thinks somebody's taxes might go down. Ephraim Ladson stood at the back with his hat in both hands. There were chairs. He was not offered one, and he did not ask. And afterward, when people told this story, that was the detail nobody could ever quite agree on. The engineer's name was Ephraim Vance. He was 31, in a suit that had been pressed that day, and he was genuinely good at the front of a room. Profile drawings on an easel, a rainfall table going back 9 years. Elevation figures read off in a voice that made disagreeing feel like poor manners. He called Otho Prine Mr. Prine. He called the district's attorney Judge. He called the commissioners gentlemen. When he got down to the south end of the district, he turned to the commissioner's table and asked whether the Ladson tract had been carried at full benefit. Then, still facing the table, he asked whether the owner understood what an assessment was. Ephraim was standing 11 feet behind him. Most of that room let it go by. Some of them never caught it at all. Otho Prine caught it, and Otho Prine put his eyes on the floor between his boots. And that is a thing a man can do for the rest of his life and never be finished with. Vance came back around with a friendlier face, which somehow made it worse. He explained kindly that the district could not consider what any one tract had suffered, only what it stood to gain, and that a benefit assessment was not a bill for damages. Then he set down his pointer and gave a piece of advice he had probably given a dozen times in a dozen counties, in the tone of a man doing somebody a favor. If the gentleman can't carry his assessment, the district would rather see that ground in hands that can. It started along the back wall. The man by the window said the Crawfish ought to pay it, and that took his whole row. And in about 4 seconds the schoolhouse had the sound in it. It wasn't hatred a man can brace against. It was the comfortable kind of laughing a room does at somebody's expense, and then forgets before the horses are untied. Vance didn't stop it. He stood there with the pointer across his knuckles and let it run out, the way you'd wait a shower out under a shed roof. Ephraim's eyes went past Vance and past the easel to the tall window at the side of the room, and out through it to the yard, where a 17-year-old boy sat on a wagon seat holding the lines, because the meeting was for property owners and there was only one of those in the family. He couldn't hear any of it out there. All he could see was a lit window with a room full of grown men laughing in it. Ephraim let it wear itself out. Then he put his hat on the bench behind him and spoke for the first and only time that night, and he did not raise his voice, and the room had to quiet itself to catch it. "You've been sending your water across my place since March," he said. "I'd like it in the minutes that I ain't asking you to stop." Vance said he wasn't sure he followed. "Keep sending it," Ephraim said. "All of it you got. Every drop all summer. Put that in the book." The laughing came back twice as big as before, because a man who has just been told to sell out and instead asks for more of what is drowning him is either broken or simple, and either one is funny at 8 o'clock at night in a hot schoolhouse. Ephraim Vance smiled and told the clerk to note the landowner's request. It went in the minutes. That page still exists in a courthouse in eastern Arkansas, in a book nobody has opened in 50 years. 9 days later, that same engineer would be standing in mud to his ankles on the Crawfish 80, and he would not be smiling. The ride home took 40 minutes, and neither one of them said anything, for 38 of them. Then Rance said, without turning his head, "You should have said something back to him." Ephraim let the mule take them another quarter mile before he answered, because he was working out how much of the truth a 17-year-old could carry into the house with him. And he took long enough that the boy turned his head. "A man like that don't want to be argued with," he said. "He wants you loud. Get loud in that room tonight, and every man in it drives home telling it a different way, and not one of them tells it about the water." Rance said it wasn't fair. He said they were laughing. He got it out in the flat, shut-down voice a boy uses when the other thing he could do is cry in front of his father. "No," his father said. It wasn't fair. The boy stopped with one foot on the porch step and got the last of it out over his shoulder. Granddaddy wouldn't have stood there and took it. Ephraim stayed out there after the lamp went off because the boy was wrong, and there was no way to prove it to him at 11 o'clock at night. Bristow Ladson had stood in fields he did not own for 27 years and swallowed worse than that on purpose, for this exact reason, so there would be 80 acres in the family for a room full of men to laugh at. Rilla brought the ledger out and set it on his knee without a word, opened to the page with the assessment on it. $272, due the 10th of October. Under it, in her hand, the balance of everything they had in the world, which was $310 they had been 3 years putting by for a second mule. He looked at it a long time. Then he got up, put his hat on, and walked 1.5 miles in the dark, down the cypress-cut road to a half-acre yard with a chinaberry tree in it, and stood at the bottom of the steps until an old woman came to the door with a coal oil lamp in her hand. Sabra Diaz was 79 years old. She had come into Arkansas in 1881 in the same emigrant car as his father, had buried 2 husbands in that county, and cooked 3 days a week for the Torrance family in town. She looked at him standing down there in the dark with his hat off. They laughed, she said. It was not a question. They did. She set the lamp on the rail and looked out toward the north, where his 80 acres lay under waters she had heard about from 4 different people before supper. Ephraim, she said, where I come from, a man paid money to get water onto his field. Ephraim came up 2 steps and stood where the lamp could reach him. Say that again. You heard it. He had, and he had heard it once before, and that was the thing he had been chewing on at the edge of that water since April. In the fall of 1911, they had buried his father on a rise behind Rock Spring Church, and while the men were still filling the hole, Sabra Diaz had looked out over the flat gray country and said, to nobody in particular, that somebody had sold Ephraim Ladson a rice field and told him it was cotton land. He was 39 years old that day and grieving, and he had let it go by. You never said it again, he said. I said it to a man in a graveyard, she said. Nobody argues in a graveyard, and nobody listens either. Then she told him why she hadn't said it since. Flat, the way you'd read a feed bill. In 1893, a man out of Memphis came around Cypress Cut, hiring what he called experienced hands, and her brother went off with him to a place in Louisiana on a promise, and nobody heard a word after the second winter. She watched her mother wait 11 years on a road. So I cook, she said. Cooking, ain't nobody ever tried to buy the whole of me for it. Ephraim stood there with his hat in his hand. I'm not hiring, he said. I'm asking. Here is what Sabra Diaz knew, and why nobody in that county had any idea she knew it. She was born in 1837, on a river in the low country of South Carolina, in a place where they had been growing rice in salt-tide country for 150 years. Those fields were not farmed the way anything is farmed in Arkansas. They were built. Banks thrown up by hand and set through each bank a trunk, a wooden box gate with doors at both ends, one to take the river in on the rising tide and one to let it back out on the fall. You put water on to sprout the seed and took it off. You put it back to drown the grass and took it off to let the plant stool out. You put it on again to carry the head. A field like that was a machine. The trunk was the throttle, and whoever minded the trunk was the most important person on the place, whether anybody said so or not. Sabra Diaz minded a trunk gate when she was 9 years old in 1846, standing on a bank in the dark with her mother, learning to read the water in the ditch by the sound it made under the door. Her people came out of that country in 1881, after the storms and the bad years finished those old fields for good, because a railroad agent said there was land in Arkansas. By then, the whole science of it, a science with no book, held in the hands of people nobody thought of as holding anything, was just an old woman's memory of being cold on a bank at night. Nobody ever asked her a single question about it in 35 years. They walked the 80 in the last week of June, the 2 of them in water to the tops of their shoes. She would not touch a survey stake. What she did instead took 4 days. She had him hitch the mule to a middlebuster and cut a shallow trench out from the north line. And then she let the district's own water into it with a hoe a little at a time and walked beside it, and where it slowed and spread, she drove a lath. Then another trench, 40 yards over. Then another. By the 4th evening there was a line of laths across that field that ran straight in no direction at all and made no sense whatever from the road. That's your bank, she said. The ground drew it. I just held the pencil. Ephraim walked to the far end and sighted back down that line of laths, and the hair came up on his arms. He had crossed that field since he was 12 years old and had never once seen the shape of it. Now the part that matters, and it is the same fact turned over. Cotton drowned on that 80, because 2 feet down there is a pan of buckshot clay that will not let water through. That is a curse for a plant that wants dry feet, but rice does not want dry feet. Rice wants 4 inches of standing water held steady for 90 days. And the hardest, most expensive thing about growing it on the Grand Prairie in 1916 was making the water stay where you put it. Men were paying $2,000 to sink a well and set a steam pump, and then losing half of what they pumped straight down through porous ground. Ephraim Ladson had a pan of clay that held water like a washpot, and a 9-mile ditch full of free water arriving at his north line by gravity, and a written request in the minutes of the district, asking for every drop of it, all summer, entered by a clerk in front of 130 witnesses, who had laughed while it was being said. He paid the assessment on the 9th of October 1916, $272 out of $310. He came home with $38 and a receipt, and he did not say a word at supper. They built through that winter, levees on Sabra's crooked lines, thrown up with a turning plow and finished by hand. He learned the first hard thing in January, when 80 feet of bank slumped into the field overnight, because he had thrown it up on top of trash instead of stripping the sod first. He rebuilt it. He learned the second in March. A levee is only as good as its lowest inch, and his eye could not find that inch. On the 11th of April, 1917, Rance Ladson took the 640 north. His father drove him to the depot and carried the grip and did not make a speech about it. What he said at the steps was that there was a bed in that house, as long as there was a house, and that a man ought to write his mother. And then he stood on the cinders with his hat off, while the train pulled out, which everybody who saw it agreed later was a thing hard to watch. 18 acres went to Rice that spring. It made 340 bushels, which was poor, and half of it was full of red rice and barnyard grass because he had let the flood down too shallow in June and given the weeds air. The Bowman threshing outfit charged him $9 to come. He paid the 1917 assessment out of it with $14 left over. In the county, that was the year the story became funny. The third failure was not his. In February of 1918, the board of the district voted to close the south outlet and carry the water east instead, on a route the engineer had drawn up the year before. It was a sensible plan. It would also, entirely by accident, have shut off every drop of water on the Crawfish 83 weeks before flooding time, with a crop's worth of levees already built. Ephraim Ladson went to that meeting with one piece of paper, and it was not his. It was a certified copy of the minutes of the 8th of June, 1916, the landowner's request for delivery of drainage water across his tract, accepted without objection, and assessed at full benefit for 2 years afterward on the strength of it. The district's attorney read it twice. Then he took his glasses off and told the board, in the voice of a man who has found a hole in his own boat, that they had better carry the water. Emory Vance did not say anything at that meeting. He came out to the farm 9 days later on his own time, on a Sunday with a level and a rod, and asked whether he might shoot the grades on those crooked banks. He was out there 11 hours. When he came in at dark, he stood by the wagon a while and said the lines were inside 1.5 inches of true contour across 1.25 miles of them, and asked what instrument had been used. Ephraim looked over at the porch, where a 79-year-old woman was shelling peas and paying no attention to anybody. "Aho," he said. 61 acres went under water that April. By the 1st of July, that field was the strangest-looking thing in Ashlock County. A mile of green so dark it was nearly blue, laid out in crooked bands, standing in 4 inches of water that had been sent there by men who wanted it gone. Otho Prine came down twice a week, said nothing much, and looked a long time. Sabra came every morning at first light and walked the main gate and put her hand flat on the water. One morning in the second week of July, she stood there longer than usual and then told him to cut 3 notches in the outside bank at the low end, 1 foot deep, no more, and leave them open. He said it would bleed water all week. "Water ain't a thing you stop," she said. "It's a thing you give a door. You don't build the door the night the company comes." He cut the notches. He thought she was old, and he cut them anyway, and that is the whole reason there is a story here. It rained 6 inches and 2/10 in 11 hours on the night of the 12th of July, 1918. Sometime after midnight, the district's spoil bank let go 3 miles up, at a place where the dredge had piled it on a soft seam, and the whole main ditch came out of its banks at once, and went looking for the lowest ground in the township. And the lowest ground in the township was a rice field at heading stage. and rice at heading stage will die in 3 days if the water goes over the tips of it and stays. Rilla saw it first from the kitchen window at about 2 in the morning, because the lightning showed the field where the field ought not to have been. What happened for the next 5 hours is the only part of this the county ever got exactly right, because too many people saw it. Ephraim Ladson went out there in his nightshirt and boots with a shovel and cut his own levees. He cut the top 3 bands first, the best rice on the place, the ones that had cost him January and February and a piece of his hands, and he let that water run out through them and down the field, so it would have somewhere to be besides on top of his crop. Dosia held the lantern. Rilla brought the second shovel. By 3 o'clock, Otho Prine was down there in the dark with a mule and a slip scraper and 2 of his hands, and nobody had gone and asked him, and nobody ever explained how he knew. Emery Vance got there at 4 in a buggy with a lamp on it, and went straight up the section line to the district's own control gate, and opened it wide onto 400 acres of Prine's cotton, which was not his to do, and which he never was able to explain to anybody's satisfaction at the office in Little Rock. And down at the bottom end all night, 3 notches a foot deep bled water out of that field as fast as it came in. There was a moment along about 4:30 when the rain quit all at once, the way it does, and every one of them stopped moving and stood in mud to the knee listening to what the water was doing. It was a sound like a long breath being let out. It was going where they had told it to go. By daylight, the level in the field had dropped 8 inches and the tops of the rice were standing up out of it. He lost 11 acres, he kept 49. Otho Prine weighed that crop at his own gin scale in September, because there was no rice scale in Elverton, and he wrote the figure on the wall in pencil and left it there, and it stayed until the gin burned in 1934. 49 acres. 2,499 bushels. 51 bushels to the acre in a year. The district's improved cotton land north of that section line made 1/3 of a bale. Rice was $1.85 that fall. Prine stood there looking at his own handwriting on his own wall a good while. "First man in this county to farm the water instead of fighting it," he said. "It ain't mine," Ephraim said. "It come out of South Carolina 80 years ago in a woman's 2 hands. And it's been sitting 1.5 miles down the Cypress Cut Road the whole time you and me been farming here." Nobody ever asked her a question. He bought the adjoining 160 acres in the spring of 1919 for $8 an acre, because it was crawfish land and nobody wanted it, and 3 men were bidding on cotton ground the same week at 42. Rance came home for the 1919 harvest on his own money, stayed through Christmas, went back north, and came home again in 1922. And that time he stayed. His father never once asked him to. What the letters had in them was numbers. In the fall of 1919, Ephraim Ladson had a lawyer in Elverton draw up a paper, and he sat on it 6 weeks before he signed it. Rilla was the one who put a stop to that. It cut 3 acres out of the northeast corner of the home place, house seat and well, and granted Sabra Diaz and her heirs the perpetual right to take water from the main gate of that farm, recorded, running with the deed, binding on him and on whoever held that ground after him. 6 weeks, and the reason was this. His father worked 27 years in another man's cotton to get one name onto one deed in a courthouse where nobody cared to write it, cutting a corner off that felt like standing up in public and agreeing it had been less than whole. Rilla told him he had it backwards. She said a deed with only one name on it was exactly what those men had spent 40 years arranging. Sabra Diaz read the paper twice, all the way through, and then handed it back and said she'd sign it if he'd change one thing. She wanted the gate called by her mother's name. It is called that now. There is a cast plate on it, put there in 1953 by a man who never met either one of them. The rest went the way those things go. The rice market broke in the last part of 1920 and took the shine off a great many people. It did not take Ephraim Ladson off, for the plainest reason in the world. No well, no pump, no engine, no note against any of it. His water cost him nothing. It arrived by gravity, all summer, at the request of the party of record. Ashlock Drainage District No. 4 defaulted on its bond interest in June of 1921. The dry fall that followed put 190 acres of improved land on the courthouse steps for unpaid assessments, and some of it belonged to men who had been 3 rows deep in that schoolhouse. That October there was no water anywhere in the township but what stood behind one main gate on the Cypress Cut Road. He opened it. He did not make a speech about it, and he did not make anybody ask twice. It went down the ditch to Prine and past Prine to 4 other places. Ephraim Ladson, who was 14 and standing there, said 70 years later that her father lifted that gate the same as any other morning, and that the only thing he said was that they'd want to get their stock water first. Emery Vance left the district in 1922 and was an engineer 31 years more. He never wrote another benefit assessment without walking the low end of the tract on foot, and when some young man called a farmer stubborn, he told him about a schoolhouse in Arkansas, where a room laughed at the only person in it who understood the water. Sabra Diaz died in 1927, 90 years old, in the house on those 3 acres, and there were more people at Rock Spring Church that day than the building would hold. They quit calling it the Crawfish 80 somewhere around 1924. Not all at once, and nobody decided it. It just turned into the Ladson place, and then later into the old rice ground, which on the Grand Prairie is a compliment. Doshia farmed it after her father. Her grandsons farm the water off that same gate today and complain about the price of rice, which is a thing every generation gets to do. Now I've turned this one over a good many times, and what stays with me is not the money. It's the arithmetic of what that county thought it was doing. They spent $86,000 and 11 years, learning to shove water off the prairie. And the whole time the man they were shoving it onto was the one person around who knew what it was worth. And they never asked, because they had already decided what he was. Folks around here will tell you the ground names itself, that a place is poor or it isn't. I don't believe it. I think a piece of ground is worth whatever the person standing on it knows how to do with it. And I think a fair number of us are farming a Crawfish 80 right now and calling it bad luck. The county's word for a thing has never once been the same as the thing. This story is true-to-life fiction. Every person, family, farm, county, and company in it is invented, and any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is coincidence.